So I would like to say welcome to everybody in the room. I'm so excited to see so many of you and your faces. Welcome to everybody joining us through Zoom, and a very special welcome to our author this month, Michelle Gable, the author of The Lipstick Bureau. Thank you so much for making time for us.
I'm so excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of libraries. I was one of those kids that would go, every other day, check out 10 books. So it's always a thrill for me when I get to do something with a library. So thank you. Thank you.
It makes me laugh that you say that you'd take out like 10 books at a time, because as I got older and I'd go into bookstores with my mom, she would have to say to me, "This isn't a library," because we'd walk with the same
You're like that
stuff,
one,
because
that
my
one, that
grandma
one.
would take me to the library and we'd have the
Yeah.
same issue. So let's talk. Let's get right into the Lipstick Bureau. I read the note at the end, which is something I sometimes don't do and has led me
Oh, good.
astray before.
I'm glad you did this time
But
because it's kind of important.
it is kind of important. I didn't read the end of The Handmaid's Tale, the note there, and that was a really important one. I learned that the hard way. Um, so what I find most interesting about the Lipstick Bureau is that it comes at a time when we are talking a lot in the news in the world about misinformation. So as soon as I started reading this, I went, oh my God, this is so applicable to what's going on in the world today. But what was the inspiration for the book for you? Where did the idea originally come from?
Well, it's funny because for most of my other books, this is my sixth novel, and I usually know exactly where it came from. And I honestly can't remember because I kind of accumulate ideas just that I see out in the world. So maybe I'll read a book and I'm like, this could be interesting, or I'll hear a podcast or see a show. So my main character of the Lipstick Bureau is based on a real person. So Barbara Lawyers was her real name, and she was a Czech native who emigrated to the United States, married an American, and then she was conscripted into the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. So right before the end of the war. And she was fascinating because she was, she escaped Europe, and then she went back to Europe, and she was in charge of propaganda, making propaganda that would go to the German soldiers. And it was propaganda that was supposed to appear as it came from the Germans. So it's not the United States being, hey guys, this Nazi stuff's really bad. It's, supposedly from the Germans. So she had to speak a lot of languages, and they sent it to Italians and, other nationalities. So when it came time to write this book, I was going through my ideas, and she kind of popped out at me. And especially, as you said, because of the whole misinformation that's going on. And, this was 2020, 2021, I'm writing this, and it felt so, and this is kind of the crazy thing. It's great, and it's sometimes scary about historical fiction, is there's so many, you could always find parallels. It's never like, oh, well, how did that happen? Or, I can't believe that. It's so many parallels. And it was just interesting to me because, of course you say, oh, well, they were spreading these lies and everything. And, but they're the good guys. But of course, everybody thinks they're the good guys, right? I mean, in this case, yes, of course, they were fighting Nazism. But, it's that thing of like, well, does everybody who spreads misinformation think they're really helping? Or some people just agents of chaos, which, I mean, I do think there's agents of chaos out there for sure. This was not this group's mission, but and also just the effect of creating these lies also on the people that are making the propaganda. So, one of her coworkers, her sister-in-law, gets kind of wrapped around the axle, like, but wait, we're lying. Like, you're not supposed to lie. That's not a good thing. Well, it's okay. It means to an end. And Nikki, my main character, does a lot of things that are questionable, but are they to a better end? Are they not? So there's a lot of gray area, shall we say.
So on the cover of the book, it says a novel inspired by true World War II events. Was it important for you to put that on there on the cover for people to know?
That was a publisher thing, and I don't know why they decided. I always like people to know that the book's about real people. All of my books are about real people or a real situation. So I definitely wanted, and that's why I always do an author's note at the end that says, like, okay, Nikki was based on this person, these characters, all the characters except for Moggy, the sister-in-law, were based on somebody. And I even used several of the characters, I used their real names. For her, I changed her name because I just find that a bit easier when I'm writing fiction, that I don't feel so tied into, like, I try to stick to the bigger issues and the bigger life events, but the day-to-day, I don't feel like, oh, well, let me make sure she was actually in the Rome office on that day. So it freed me up a little bit, but many of the characters in that Rome office were really there. Ezra was based on the cartoonist Saul Steinberg. So I think it's like a marketing thing that the publisher decides to put that on the cover. I'm not really sure. They kind of asked me, can we put this on the cover? And I said, yeah, that's fine. Fine with me. I mean, that's accurate.
So you're writing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
What's your research process like for something like this? Because it is inspired by real people. You have multiple languages in
Mm-hmm.
this book. So how's your research process? What's that like before you even set to writing, or do you write and research at the same time? Walk us through that.
I've gotten much better about controlling the research because I used to do all my research in advance for months and months, but then you don't always know where the research is going to slot in. So then I would find myself wanting to be like, here's a fun fact, and had nothing to do with the plot, but I just want to jam it in somehow. So it's easier. I mean, I'll read, dozens and dozens of books. For one of my books for The Summer I Met Jack, I read over 200 books, but you can skim some of it if like, okay, well, I don't really need to know about this part. So I started with Barbara, who Nikki is based on. I started with her, I literally just started at her Wikipedia page. So like the most basic thing you could get. Then I tried to get my hands on anything I could find about her article. I have subscriptions to various newspaper archives and things. Articles about her, books that are about her. It's not easy much, and this is very applicable to many of all the books I've written. A lot of the books I'll end up using are books that are out of print. So I do use libraries a lot, or if you can find something online, because sometimes you can search it and then you find a tidbit online that was from the book, and then you can find the book. So libraries are very important because most of the books are out of print, and even sometimes you can't even get like a used copy on the internet. So I kind of branch out from there. I've taught myself to learn just enough so that I know I can write the story, but not worry too much. And it's hard for me because I want to be like, well, what about this little detail? So one thing that was very difficult was that, and it was kind of reflected in the novel almost, because Nikki's from the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, and she's having trouble getting information about her family and what's going on. And I had trouble getting information about what was happening day to day. I can see the higher level things like, well, there was this battle and this fight and this, but like, I wanted to know, like, what was it like day to day living there? And there was a lot of information coming out. And then a lot of the buildings were, bombed, destroyed. And from all of my books, if I find something that I think might be relevant in another language, I will have it translated, or at least pieces of it translated, or I'll even put it through Google Translate. Even if it's not an exact replica, at least you can get a sense of like, okay, this is what was happening. So that part, and I like to read memoirs of people that were experiencing something, and it was very difficult. I found one memoir of a Czech person that lived there during that time. It was just very, very hard to find that kind of information. And then even some of the information just in Italy, and Italy was very confusing at that time because it was after the liberation of Rome. So they'd switch sides, but still half the country was Axis, half was Allied. So kind of figuring out where those demarcations are, and I guess the practicality of everything. And I also read a lot of Stars and Stripes, the army newspaper. I subscribed to their archives. So they had an army newspaper they had a version out of Rome. So I would read all those. And that was kind of fun because my dad actually wrote for Stars and Stripes in Vietnam. So, kind of felt that connection. So I try to do as much as I can to start. And then the whole time I'm writing, I'm continuing to do research. I'll do brackets of things that I want to figure out. And then I know that once I send it to my editor, I have more time, and then I can really focus. If my editor has it, I can't do any work. So I'm just going in all the research, trying to just pluck out more information. I found several memoirs written by women that were in the OSS, which is what, Nikki was in. And so it's just kind of all of those pieces of it.
So how long did it take you to get your first draft actually done?
I'm trying to think. So the writing part is usually pretty easy quick with, I wouldn't say easy, that's the wrong word. Quick, aside from the research, because if I do that, I'm pretty disciplined. I can say, okay, do 1,000 words a day. And if you do 1,000 words a day, it's like a book is 100,000 words. That's like 3 months, kind of look at it that way, which isn't a long time. Now, of course, that's a very rough draft, not anything you could show. So I I can't even remember when I started writing it. Around this time last year, the book was finished, like final. So it probably took a year and then some all in, then I had to do quite a bit of revising because we had a different modern day storyline and we took that out and put in the new one. And then there was a few other things I had to tweak. And my editor wanted, initially the book started in Rome, but she wanted to see their training and everything leading up to going to Rome. So it's hard because it's such a back and forth process, right? Like you're not just writing every day for a year, you're writing and then you're researching and then you're sending it to your editor and then she comes back with all pages and pages of notes and then you're implementing those as best as you can.
So this story, there's a lot of back and forth.
Mhm.
How do you write a back and forth story like that? Do you have your plot line of current day, your plot line of past, and then weave them in, or do you write going back and forth as you go?
I go back and forth as I go usually. It depends. I mean, on other books, I have done it a little bit differently, but then a lot of times when I'm editing, I'll go back through and just do one storyline just to make sure that flows and then the other one. So it's a little bit of both, but I will usually go back and forth. And then sometimes what happens is I'll write a bunch of the historical and I'll be like, okay, I need to break it up somewhere right about here. So let me, see what I can do.
Are you a plotter or are you someone who meanders through your story?
I definitely plot it. I mean, I'm not, I always veer from my plot, always. Like it's never whatever I planned originally, it's never pans out. But I find it helpful to have a plot and to have kind of, I'm always finishing up by like kind of doing an outline of what are the next kind of, so I'm always kind of looking, I'll do an overall plot and like where the main turning points are. And as I'm writing, I'm like, okay, here's the plot for like the next 3 sections or the next 3 chapters or whatever. So I'm always kind of, okay, what happens after that? Like, because, you want one scene to lead into the next.
Okay, let's talk about some of the characters and the plot lines because you have this love story of sorts woven through. Is that something that you intended on having, that Will story all the way through and that moment with her daughter in the end where she realizes who her mom actually was?
Yeah, I definitely was planning to, I wanted to include that because he was a real character. And even though I read nothing that said that they had an affair, everything I read was like they were such close partners, they worked together all the time. Nothing in particular straight out said that they were romantically involved. However, I probably shouldn't, I don't want to give any spoilers here, but
You can give
right, because
spoilers. It's fine. It's
oh, I
fine.
can't.
You
Okay.
can. Yeah, it's fine.
Well, when I read that she had had a daughter and the timing of the birth of the daughter, and they like whoever was writing about her didn't know who the father was, like, and then he died, right around the time she would have been, I don't know. I'm like, well, obviously he was the dad. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that was my assumption. That's why I was like, oh yeah, he's got to be the love interest. I usually like to have a little bit of a love interest in all I mean, I definitely wouldn't call my books romantic. They're not romances, but I do like to have that little piece of it most of the time.
What about her husband? Was he a real person and was he as unlikable as you wrote him?
I have no idea if her husband was unlikable, but they did get divorced. So that whole piece was correct. Like she married him, she was in Czechoslovakia doing all these things, right? She was like a journalist. She was a lawyer. Considering she was very young, she had quite a few careers under her belt. She was very well educated, had like been educated in Paris. And she did meet him when he was there for work. And then they got married and she moved to the States. And then he went into the war and then she did. And then they got divorced right after. So I don't know anything about him. I think I found he died maybe like in the 80s or something. And I think I found some like family members, but so I just, another reason to change names because I didn't want to malign her for, obviously they didn't get along if they got divorced, but, and especially in that day and age, right? People didn't really get divorced that frequently, but I just decided to make him kind of a creep, controlling jerk.
When you base a book on real people, as you have in your other books, do you reach out to their family or to their descendants to let them know that this is coming in any way, shape, or form?
I usually don't. Sometimes I've called somebody that's like I mean, a lot of people are dead by the time I start writing about them. So it's really not. And then um I will sometimes, I won't a lot, because I also don't want them to think it's not, I don't want them to, it's not a biography, right? So it's like, I don't, and then if they get mad that I write something and then it says in the front it's fiction, they're like, why did you talk to me? I just feel like it would open more problems maybe than it would be like, you know, good. And also another reason to change the name, right? So there was in one of my books too, I was like, oh gosh, I needed, it was, whether JFK had a love child with this woman, which I 100% think he did in one of my books. And that woman, the quote unquote love child, is still alive. And I'm like, I got to change her name, because I do not want to be accusing this woman of being, even though I 100% think she is, I didn't want to go down that road. So I'm like changing her name. But I've talked to like people's random like ex-husbands and things like that, just to get a sense of, but it is fiction. So I don't want to be too tied into like exactly what happened.
When you wrap up a book, you've done all this research, you talk about these people like you know them. Is
Mm-hmm.
it hard to close it up and say, okay, on to the next one? Like, do you miss them? Do you miss your characters?
Sometimes, yeah. But then I also get very like, when I was promoting the Lipstick Bureau, and I'm so wrapped up in the book I'm writing now that you're like, okay, wait, step back. Look, yeah, don't confuse the characters. Cause I'll be like, oh, 1960. No, wait, does not take place in 1960. So, there's definitely some characters I love. I loved like Ezra and the Lipstick Bureau. He was so much fun, and I loved Will and Nikki. And so I like that little group, their little Rome group. And so it was sad to like leave them behind.
Is there a favorite character in the book that you're a little attached to?
Definitely Nikki, and then Ezra, I would say, the cartoonist. He was just, and he was a really, much of what is said about him and there is about Saul Steinberg, who was the original guy, and he's pretty famous. Like most people have probably seen his work. I don't know, he's just a fascinating character, and just the funny wit, and just where he came from and where he went and how he made it happen, faking his immigration papers and getting deported and then getting a job at the New Yorker, all these kind of little twists and turns. He was a fascinating character.
There are a lot of books written about World War II. I'm curious what
Mm-hmm.
kind of feedback you've gotten from people, because there are some people who kind of fancy themselves experts.
Well, no one's like, people will email writers, and I'm sure if you've talked to writers, they've told you this, like, this is nobody so far, knock on wood. And I don't read Goodreads or anything. So I don't, I do my best to make it accurate. And if somebody comes back and says, something, it's just, it's kind of like, well, like in one of my books, somebody said, oh, they didn't even have hula hoops until this year. And I'm like, I don't remember there being a hula hoop in my book, but okay, good job. So if I really do my best to try to try to get the historical accuracy right. But they're going to be nitpickers, and you do usually reach out. But
We did
so
have
far,
we had a book club meeting once, and one of our participants called out one of our authors because she didn't believe the way one of I don't know if you guys remember this. She didn't like the way that one of the people died. She said it wasn't a plausible reason, and she said, "But my husband said it would work." Like this author had talked it over with her husband, and it seemed like a plausible murder. And I don't want to like call the author out all over again, but it was really funny
yeah,
because she was forced in this like really public way to be like, "I've never murdered anyone before, but my
yeah.
husband said
So
it
I did
probably
my
work."
best. I did. Yes, and that's how I truly try to do my best. And if I miss something, like, sorry, it's fiction. It's not meant to be, it's not meant
It's
to
not a
be
biography.
historically accurate. Like, do not write your school paper on this based on this book. Like, don't.
So what's your favorite part of being an author? I mean, lots of people dream about writing books for a living, but what's your favorite part of being able to do that?
That's a really good question. I don't think many people have asked me that in all my years. I mean, it's always, I've written since I was little, so it's always been an escape for me. So it's just fun to escape into other people and time periods and get to like live out jobs or people, use baby names I didn't use for my kids, like whatever you want. Living out the, like, it's a stress relief most of the time. I mean, sometimes it's stressful. And also just the other authors I've met, I just find like it's a very warm, wonderful, at least the historical fiction writers that I know. It's a very warm community, and library. I mean, you can't beat librarians, you can't beat the booksellers. So it's just like the community itself. It's really good people. And readers, most readers, there'll be some readers that are trying to get you or whatever. But most readers are just want to read something good and entertaining and maybe learn a little something along the way. So my favorite thing is when people, email me or message me on social media and say, oh my gosh, I'd never heard of this. Like if they say like I spent time Googling after I read your book, that to me is a huge compliment. Like, oh my gosh, I was fascinated by this. So I was Googling and I saw this and this and this. Like, I love that when someone says they did additional research based on something I wrote.
Do you write what you read, or do you write what you like? Like, are those things the same? I'm curious when authors are reading, if I know some deliberately don't read anything in their genre while they're writing because they don't want to be influenced by it, and others read tons. So I'm curious
Oh,
what
I
you're.
absolutely do read in my genre because I think it's important. I mean, you're not gonna like plagiarize. You know what I'm saying? And it's important you learn so much from reading about just like the structure of a book and how the pacing or whatever. And you can get inspired by, you might read a book, and I'm writing a book and I'm reading another one, and that author takes a risk that's unexpected. And then it kind of reminds me, okay, maybe take a risk that's unexpected. Because, I'll admire something. Like, I love how you expected it to go this way and they did this and they took this risk, and it was not an easy thing to do. And then it just makes you inspired. Okay, where can I do something surprising or take a risk and things like that. And so to me, I mean, I don't just read historical fiction when I'm writing. I read across a lot of genres, but I will, and I also will, if I'm feeling like my writing is like kind of going slowly, I'll try to just be reading like really good engrossing books to kind of get me like in that mood, so to me, it's helpful. It just, and then just when you're impressed by somebody's words and what they got on paper, like it's inspiring. So it makes you want to step up to the plate and do it too.
I'll come back to what you're reading in a minute, but I wanted to ask you, what is your writing process like? Like, what do you do during a day when you're writing a book? What does a day look like for you when you're in writing mode? Or are you always in writing mode?
I'm not always in writing mode. So if you submit it to my editor, I wait, or if I'm doing the preliminary research. So I like I said, I normally have a word count goal. So however I get that is how I get that. So some days I do some consulting work. So sometimes I'm really busy doing consulting for investor relations and finance. So some days I'll do, it's all I can do to get 1,000 words in, or, I'm doing stuff with my kids or whatever. So to me, it's really just, I try to do it first thing in the morning. I mean, that's ideal because I get sleepy in the afternoon. It's easy to put things off. It's easy to be like, I need to clean the kitchen. I need to do this. It's easy to get distracted. So it's really just about just getting the word count goal. And of course, if there's some day that is just nuts because my kids have games and this and that, like it's more a weekly goal that's divided into days. So as long as I hit my weekly goal overall, then I don't stress too much about any daily goal. And it's always based on when I need to turn it in, how much time I need to, I think I need to, I love numbers, like I'm a numbers person. So it's kind of fun for me to be like, okay, well, if I do this amount of words per day until this date, it's
Do
like
you
a
force
competition.
yourself to write every day? Like, is that something you make yourself do
For
every day?
sure. For sure. Again,
What
unless
happens if you don't?
I'll give myself grace if it's just impossible. But I mean, I write on like I had a book due like January 2nd or whatever. Like I wrote on Christmas Day, I wrote on Christmas Eve. There's some days that are just not going to happen if you're traveling for some reason, or there's just, or you don't feel, I got COVID last year when I was writing, the book that I just turned it. So I did not feel up for my brain was fuzzy. So, as long as I'm on track overall and I make up those words, and because 1,000 words isn't a lot of words, it's pretty easy to hit it. But if I don't, it's pretty easy to make that up if you just do a couple hundred words, on the next few days. So it's, I won't, stay up all night or do anything crazy like that. But as long as I'm pretty focused and I don't waste time, I can, it's, if I'm sitting down at my computer and I know I have the time, I can usually get it done, unless I'm just really struggling, but that's pretty rare.
Okay, you said investor and financial relations. Those, your two career paths are very different. So
Yes.
is that what you're like technically trained in, is finance and
Yeah.
investments and stuff, but then you just meandered your way into historical fiction writing?
Yes, I actually have an accounting degree, which is funny, but I've always loved to write. So like since I was a little kid, I would write these, horrible novels when I was in middle school. They were so bad, but I was a reader and a writer. But I also knew that, my parents weren't going to like support a starving artist and I needed to get a real job. And I love numbers. Like, and there is that thing, the thing I like about accounting. Now I went into finance and accounting, but what I liked about accounting is, if you got it right, because it has to balance and it's both sides. And I do feel like with a lot of writing is intuitive. Like I can know that a scene, like this scene is not working. I don't know why, but although words are technically accurate, it's not right. So it's finding that balance. So I do find that it's also a nice kind of counterbalance the two, so, the two sides. So I generally do like numbers and things like that. And then for investor relations, it's kind of funny because we have to do these, they're called non-deal roadshows, and you go out and you're basically telling, hedge funds like buy our stock, this is why. So investor relations is really telling a story of like why this quarter was great and why you should buy the stock and why you should invest in this company. I mean, it's very similar. And I've said before, like a book tour is very much like an NDR, because you're telling a story, you're trying to entice people to buy this. And it's actually, the book tour is better because it's not like, hedge fund people that are going to be, they're trying to do a gotcha or like find some little hole or whatever. I mean, some readers are like that, the real history buffs. But it's very similar, and there is a storytelling, and and it's actually kind of fun because when my clients like find that out, they're like, what? I'm very confused that you're a writer. That is really weird. I'm like, hey, I can tell a story. I can help, hopefully theirs is not fiction, but
I like that disclaimer there.
yes.
That's
Yes.
not fiction.
Yeah, no
So
propaganda there.
what's the best book you've read in the last year? What's the first thing that popped into your head? Don't overthink it. What's
I
the
know.
first thing that popped
Unlikely
into your head?
Animals by Annie Hartnett.
And what's that about?
Oh gosh, it is so hard to describe. This girl comes back to her hometown, and her dad is like kind of having dementia issues. It's kind of like a going back as an adult, and there's a lot of problems going on. And she's kind of bumbling her way. Like she gets like a substitute teacher position. She's trying to teach these kids, but she was like originally on a different career path. And then it's narrated by the people living in the cemetery, the people dead in the cemetery, the townsfolk that have passed on. So it'll be like, Bobby, 1970 through 1999, and how he died. And then he'll like make a comment. I don't know. It's just brilliant. She also wrote Rabbit Cake, which was another great book. So I just was very inventive, very funny, like I like a real dry sense of humor, very witty. And I love it. I loved Lessons in Chemistry too by Bonnie Garmis. That was another great book.
Awesome. What are you working on now before I open it up to questions? You said you're in the middle of another book, so what are you working on now?
Yes, I turned in my book, and then I already got my editorial things back. So now there's a lot of heavy lifting going on. So this one is it takes place in the jet set 60s. And it's about Lily Pulitzer. And she was fascinating. She was an heiress, and she was living in Palm Beach, and she'd had like 3 kids in 4 years. And she was feeling kind of like, just, what am I doing? Just stress. What am I doing? Is this all my life is? And she went to see a psychologist, and she's like, I think I'm cracking up, and he's like, no, you need a hobby. Like, that's your problem, is you need a hobby. And her husband like owned all these orange groves. And so she decided that she was going to start like a juice company. So a fruit company. And so she was going to make fruit baskets and give them and sell them to all her like wealthy friends in Palm Beach. So she starts making these fruit baskets. It's very popular. All her friends are buying it. It's like the thing to give. And then, but her friends are very picky. So they're like, well, no bruised fruit. So she decided with the bruised fruit, she was going to juice them. But then she was like very klutzy. And so she would spill all over her dress. And so she decided, she bought out all the crazy patterns at the Five and Dime and had her seamstress make shift dresses that she could juice fruits in, just, basic. And then her good friend from growing up or from school, Jackie Kennedy, wanted one. And then she exploded. So it's fascinating. It's told through Slim Aarons, who's a photographer. He photographed the jet set. It's like Acapulco, Palm Beach, Gustad, all these places. It's told through his assistant, a fake assistant, who's kind of trying to be part of that world. And so she's observing, Lily Pulitzer and other people in that world, trying to break into the jet set and, social climb our way to the top.
Okay, I have to ask. So did you have that idea and pitch it? Do you have a book deal where you just get to write about wherever you want? Like how did it, that sounds great, but I'm just wondering how that became your story for the next book.
Yeah, so when I signed the Lipstick Bureau deal, I signed, or no, wait, hold on, let me think about that. I signed, so when I signed with the Bookseller Secret, my last book, I signed a 2-book deal, and it was the Bookseller Secret and then another book that's similar, it's just basically another book. That was a Lipstick Bureau. And then I signed another 2-book deal, and it was with that idea, but it was kind of like a little bit more loosey-goosey because, now that I've established myself. So I knew I've always wanted to write about Slim Aarons. I wanted to go forward in time. I wanted to, as much as I like World War II, I wanted to do a new time period, like further ahead in time. And I love Slim Aarons. So I pitched kind of something Slim Aarons because he, photographed all the beautiful people. His whole motto was attractive people doing attractive things in attractive places. That was his motto. And his pictures are amazing. And so I could talk this through with my editor, and she's like, well, is there like somebody you could focus on that he photographed a lot? I'm like, well, Lily Pulitzer is fascinating because she started these dresses out of, necessity, kind of just to keep herself occupied, and became this huge deal. So, and she was like, yes, I love that. So I have leeway, but I have to pitch it to them and they have to agree to it.
It sounds really, really interesting.
It's been so fun.
But you pitch books that are very research heavy.
I know, I do. I'm like, one of these days I'm going to try a modern day that's like no research. I can't even imagine what to not research. I do like to learn things though when I'm writing. Like that is part of the fun for me to just pick up some random tidbit of knowledge where, bore my family or whatever with like this latest thing I learned. But I feel like
I'm sure you're great at dinner parties.
or hopefully, but I feel like not many people know about Lily Pulitzer, and she's fascinating. So it's all that kind of stuff. I know I really do want to, like, maybe I'll just do it in the 90s that I can remember so I don't have to do the research, because that does sound appealing sometimes.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to any of you have a question that I can pass along to Michelle in the room, or Jimmy K here. If you have any questions, you can type them into the little chat box. Any questions? Mm-hmm. Carla would like to know the dinner in '89 where she was there with her daughter. Did that dinner actually happen where they celebrated the OSS?
Yes, that dinner happened. So that's why I got the idea to set it there at that time. That was like the only kind of time they all got back together.
He's wondering if you know what the driver for the dinner was, like why they decided to have it then.
Oh, that's a really good question. And I don't remember if I knew that or not, because it wouldn't have been an anniversary of any sort. So I don't know if somebody just decided to do that. That's a really good question. I feel like there was a reason, but I'm just not remembering now. But it's sorry, that is a great question.
No, that's okay. Anybody else? I've asked a lot of questions, so they just may not have any more questions. They're all trying not to make eye contact with me as if I'm gonna call on them later
It's
at
like you're in
school.
you're a teacher.
Everyone
You're
looks
in class.
straight, just slightly off center. Well, I mean, I could keep asking you questions, but I feel like you've answered all of my questions, and I have so thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, Michelle, that I feel like
Me
if
too.
there are no more questions from the crowd, no more, this is your last chance. No more questions? Courtney, any questions? Okay. Oh, Carla's got one more. Please hold.
Sounds
Yeah.
good.
The character of Paloma. He is interested on where you got the information, if you read something about her, where did Paloma come from?
That's a good question. So she is a fictional character, and I honestly don't remember. I think I read about how a lot of the housewives, they had to make a living by doing sex work first, and they even had to service the Germans, even though, many of them were against what they were saying. So I read something about that, and I thought it would be an interesting side character. Somebody that's seen the war in Rome, from the Roman perspective, from the beginning, occupation, all the way through, and might be a little cynical that while they're glad to not be under Nazi rule, like, the Americans aren't the greatest necessarily. So, that kind of a little bit cynical piece of it. Because, of course, the characters, the OSS characters, are like, we're the heroes, we're gonna liberate you, we're gonna free you, everything's gonna be great. And just kind of a little bit more of a, like, it's not so black and white.
As you talk about that, it made me think about the ending and the homecoming and the fact that her parents had survived the war. Did her parents in real life actually survive the war? Was that, or did you take some artistic liberty there?
I definitely took artistic liberties. I could not figure out, that was one of those things where I could not figure out what her parents, what happened to them. So
Where
I
did
tried to
you
find
draw
records.
from in like writing that? Because that scene was very visual to me. Like I could very much imagine how you wrote that scene.
I mean, I definitely read a lot of accounts of what it looked like when people came back. So just kind of the decimation, but then there's like the one hotel that's still open. And then I just tried to, I've read a lot of memoirs and read a lot of books and biographies about people. I mean, it's interesting to me, those people that were not necessarily pro Germany, but also they just try to keep their head down and cooperate in their own best interest, where, like, well, so what is that like? I don't know. So that was the inspiration for that.
Do you have another question? Okay, I want to take it back to where we began before I let you go, because we started with misinformation and I'd like to end on that note. I'm curious, when you think about history and you think about the misinformation that was used in not just in World War II, misinformation
Oh
is
yeah.
used all the time. I'm curious what books like this do for the bigger conversation and about the importance of the truth and if the truth really is important. Because in some cases, I think people would argue the truth was not as important as the greater good.
Right. And that's what these characters, many of them, would argue. So really, like, I want the book to be more of a conversation piece where people might have differing ideas about. I mean, yeah, lying is bad, and we all agree, and especially something that's going to actively harm people.
Mhm.
That's not good. But I wanted it to be a little bit open ended in that sense, where you could make an argument. Even though they're the quote unquote good guys, you could say, well, yeah, but when she did this, was there a better way she could have gone? But their whole job was the misinformation. I mean,
Mhm.
they were supposed to literally lie and pretend they had a German newspaper and all of these other things. So, and I did want to mention, like, all the campaigns they did in the book are real campaigns that the office did.
Do you think
So
that this is still happening today?
probably, I mean, you've got to think, right? Right. It's like, just that
Yeah.
you think you're seeing it from I mean, there's been other things of just, in a different way, but Russia interfering in our elections by posting news stories that appear to be from US sources. I mean, it's very similar in that
Mhm.
way, where it's like, it's not obvious. You're not looking and you're like, oh, well, this is Russian. It's written in Russian. Like, so
Mhm.
obviously I'm not going to read this, but it's that kind of masking the true person. And so you can't, it's easy to say, if somebody, certain people, if they're telling you something's true, there's certain people where you just be like, okay, anything you say, just, I'm not going to believe. But if it comes through another source that does seem more trustworthy, then it's very interesting.
And even when you bring up Russia and Ukraine and the way the war is going on right now, and the way that so many news bureaus have closed in Moscow because they couldn't get the information out that was factual because everything was being controlled by the Kremlin. So,
Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting when you think that, history is hindsight in 2020 and it's so interesting this happened in the past, but at the same time, it's
it's
still
very
very much
relevant.
reality today.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's kind of scary because you're like, again, it's like, well, what's the source? What's the source? And it can seem like an okay source, but is it?
And such is my life as a journalist.
I'm sure.
Michelle, thank you so much for the book and for your time tonight. And we look
Thank
forward
you.
to taking a look at the next one on the jet set.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. That was so fun.